We talked about, you know, the axe murders, and then we talked about the circus and Resurrection Mary, and then I'm trying to think of what can cap all this off, and the Black Dahlia.
Oh, sure,
Yeah.
sure.
You know, your book is called Fallen Angel. And what is your
Yeah.
take on what happened with the Black
Well,
Dahlia?
I'm not going to say that no one ever died in the Hodel house,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm going to say it wasn't Beth Shore. I've got an entire chapter of the book dedicated to the fact that George Hodel could not have been the Black
Mm.
Dahlia killer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Quest, a journey into true crime and the paranormal. My name is Misti Gaither, and I am here. My guest is, I'm just really thrilled to have him here on the show. Troy Taylor, author, has his own tours, American Haunting events, American Haunting conferences, Haunting podcast, and I mean, I'm just really excited to talk to you because the last count that I saw, and it may be more now, but you have written over around 150 books on true crime, the paranormal.
Yes, my 150th book came out on April the 12th. So you are right on it, actually.
And that would be the One Midnight in Texas.
Yep, it sure was.
Okay, and that's the story of the servant girl. What is that?
Annihilator.
Annihilator, correct? And
Annihilator. Or you could call it the Midnight Assassin, or you could call it Austin's Jack the Ripper, or you can call him anything you want to, pretty much.
right, I mean,
One of those kind of things, one of those kind of stories.
yeah, yeah, several monikers. Now, let me ask you this: you know, you were saying that, you know, because this was happening in towards the end of 1884,
Hmm.
and you were saying that this was actually one of America's first serial killer
Well, the first documented serial killer.
documented.
Yeah, the first kind of serial killer like we know of today, as far as one that acted in a certain way, committed a certain series of crimes, a certain number of crimes, always using the same modus operandi, and continued to, continue to strike even after being hunted by the police. He taunted the police, and then one day he just stopped and went away. And there are a lot of theories about that too, which I explore in the book. But yeah, that's the first time that America had documented a serial killer that acted like one that we know today. And the word serial killer, of course, didn't come around until the 1970s, but we'd had multiple murderers in the past. But that was, it's 1884. There had been other killers for sure, but nothing quite like this one.
So what you're saying is kind of that the 1884, the servant girl annihilator, that these killings kind of kicked off of what we know. Uh, do you think that maybe some of these the axe murders throughout the country are connected?
Well, that's a that's a loaded question,
Mm-hmm.
as it turns out. This is my third book that I've written about unsolved axe murders. I'm going to write more. I've written three different books about three different killers, none of which I believe are connected. However, this was a guy, this was the first one of the bunch, and he was committing these murders in Austin, Texas. And then, depending on, how you feel about what I do at the end of the book, he might have committed some other murders, but not these particular ones that I've already written about. The next one that I wrote about, in reverse order, as it turns out, I did a book called Victims of the Axe Fiend, and it was about a killer who traveled by rail through Louisiana and Texas, killed about 45 people, I believe, putting together the different crime scenes of all the people that he killed, and connecting these stories. This guy was completely different from the servant girl annihilator, not only because he traveled by train, but also because of the types of murders he committed. They were all kind of with a religious fervor, a religious flavor to them. And he also only killed mixed race people, usually couples, children, a lot of children. But all of them were either Black or were from mixed race families in every single case. So this guy had a specific MO. But eventually, like so many of them do, he disappeared too. The next one that I tracked was almost by accident. I was writing about, and this was, I mean, we're talking about like 2008 or so. I was writing about the murders in Villisca, Iowa. This was before they became super well known.
Mhm.
The first time I had been there was in 2005. So, I mean, I certainly wasn't the first, but, it wasn't as well known outside of Iowa as it is today. So I had gone to Villisca and started digging into that story. And as I was trying to put together a book on that particular case, those murders that happened in that one small town, I thought, well, I could kind of flesh out the book with some other similar type murders. But I've always been fascinated with axe murders, especially in the 1800s and early 1900s, because axes were such a weapon of choice because they were so convenient. I mean, everybody had one. You had to have one. That's how you heated your house. That's how you got your chickens for dinner. Everybody had an axe. And so there were lots and lots of axe murders. And I thought, well, you know what? Why don't I see if I can flesh this out and kind of, build up some momentum going into Villisca. But when I started doing that, I started running across other murders that were not just similar to what happened in Villisca, but absolutely identical. So when I started gathering those stories, I realized that there had actually been about 6 different murder scenes that were exactly like Villisca, and they had happened in Illinois and Iowa and in Kansas. And they were, Colorado Springs was another one, but they were identical. And this is before the man on the train story started, which they did credit me in their book, but then they went on to add like 100 other murders. Listen, every axe murder in the country wasn't committed by the same person.
Right, right.
But that's the way that the book comes across, and it's like, guys, you got to calm this down a little bit. But I do think that there was a connection between those murders in Villisca, and I could put together a pretty good, I felt like a pretty good background to the story and a pretty good bunch of evidence that showed that I think that was accurate. So I'm sure there will be other axe murder books that I will do. In fact, I already know there will be. But this was my latest one, and I really enjoyed working on it. I'm not I don't spend tons of time in Texas, but I've been to Austin quite a few times, and I went down and, and walked around to the places where this stuff happened, of which there is nothing left. But at least I got to see some of the stuff in the story. And, I dug into newspapers, which is awesome because I've been writing for 30 years. So I remember when I first started, if I wanted a newspaper story, first I had to find the newspaper, then hope to God I could find the right dates. And then I had to go down to the library and go through the microfiche and print stuff. And it's not like that anymore, thank goodness. Now it's all at my fingertips, which is really, really nice for nutcases like me that will spend 4 hours trying to write one paragraph in a book, just trying to find the exact information that I want. So being able to do that at home and not have to go somewhere is a big advantage these days.
Oh, no doubt, because yeah, you just type it in and there you go, and it pulls everything up for you. Now,
Yeah.
for those of you that watch the show, I have just a really a big interest into axe murders, and I think I've found my kindred spirit here because
Yeah,
we can
I
talk
think
about
so.
Clementine Barnabet, and we can really get into the
Oh,
weeds of
sure,
everything
sure.
about that, and about, of course, New Orleans, the Axe Man, and it's
Oh,
so
yeah.
many
Yeah.
stories. But there was one particular case that you had wrote about that, um, the Hammond Circus Train Wreck.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that is really interesting, and I don't know why. I don't know why that I have such an interest in the axe murders. I don't know, and I don't know why I've always had an interest about the circus
Yeah,
and the
the
history.
axe murder thing, I
Yeah,
can't begin to tell you why I'm so
yeah,
fast. I have absolutely no idea. The circus stuff, though, at least I can lean a little heavier into that because I had family who toured with carnivals, and
okay.
so I got to go with them sometimes, which is kind of what led me to starting my own oddities museum because I needed something else to do. But the circus stuff fascinates me just because it's such a lost thing. I mean, we still have circuses, but I mean, they're not even the same as they were when I was a kid, let alone, 75, 80 years ago, or, the turn of the last century. So the rise of circuses in America and that kind of entertainment and stuff has always fascinated me. It's fascinated me all through growing up. And that particular, accident that happened that took so many lives on that stretch of railroad tracks, is it's brutal. And, it's the one that's become famous, even though there were lots of others. I've run across a lot of different stories of not only accidents on railroads, but like epidemics that broke out among circus, performers, and then they'd end up buried in a little graveyard somewhere, and nobody knew what their names were, so they're buried under their nicknames. And that's the same thing that happened with that wreck in Indiana. The train is on its way north. It collides with another train. Lots of people are killed. No animals killed, just performers. But then, of course, the bodies were taken to Showman's Rest, which at the time, to us now, we think, wow, that is really far away. How did they end up over in the southwest suburbs of Chicago, all the way from northern Indiana to
Right.
be buried? Well, that was donated land that had been purchased by the the Showman's Association of America, which was started by Buffalo Bill Cody, who was helping out an awful lot of people during that time period, and had been since the late 1800s, putting people to work who couldn't find work any other way. Native Americans who, were living on reservations, and cowboys who'd lost their jobs, and people like, Wild Bill Hickok, who he would give him some things to do to keep him busy. And then, of course, he ended up in Deadwood, and we know how that ended. But,
Right.
all these people were dependent on, people like Buffalo Bill, who was making a fortune. And in this particular case, he donated this property in the cemetery. And so that's where they took these people, because they were indigent. They had no money to pay for burial plots. And if you visit there today, you'll find not only the names of the people, but you'll find Baldy and, Slick and Lefty and all these people. That's the only names that are on their stones. Some of them don't have names at all, because they never gave them when they were working for the circus. People paid in cash back then. So you didn't need to come up with a social security number or
Right.
anything. None of
Lefty
that stuff mattered.
and
Right.
Slick.
So, and then, what I think has made that one so famous is that there were a couple of wags who decided to start a story about how, if you were, in the cemetery at night, you could hear the sounds of circus elephants drifting on the wind, and that these ghostly animals were haunting the cemetery. They forgot to mention that just down the road was Brookfield Zoo.
Okay.
And so the only thing anybody was hearing were animals from the zoo. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of truth to the ghost stories that haunt the cemetery. But I think the history involved is probably definitely better than any of those ghost stories that got made up about the place.
Well, they have the cemeteries at the Woodlon Cemetery in Chicago, and it was like a
Mhm.
hundred of them were just kind of put into like a mass grave.
Yeah, for the most, yeah,
Yeah.
there were rows that were dug, and there was and so they just lined them up, and then they just lined up all the stones over them. But Showman's Rest paid for all that stuff. So, yeah, it's just one part of the cemetery, and it's not just these performers that are buried there. There's a lot of other people from around the Chicago area buried there too. Burlesque, performers, vaudeville performers, people who couldn't afford, to pay for their own funerals and things. That the Showman's Association stepped in and paid for that stuff. And, that's another one of those things that's just sort of been lost to history, just like our circuses and the sideshows and things. We talk about the circuses, and people will bring up the sideshows. And while there were plenty of performers who were horribly treated during that time, not all of them were. That's something that a lot of people don't realize. I mean, we look at it now, and it's certainly not politically correct for people to line up and stare at people, who have, deformities and an extra arm and things like that. But back then, at a time when, you had no idea, birth defects and things, nothing that could be predicted. People had no idea about how anything to do with medicine even worked. When people were born with, what we would consider to be, a deformity or a handicap, it would become for them the only way they could make a living. And a lot of those people that were involved in the sideshows made a really, really good living. I just recently, for my oddities museum, I came across a collection of postcards from the 1860s that General Tom Thumb had sold at his shows so that people, make a little extra money in addition to the performances. And so I was putting together a display and an exhibit on Tom Thumb. And I started to write some things up about him. And as I did my research, I was finding out, this guy owned houses and complete wardrobes. He owned a yacht. At one point, P.T. Barnum, who had given him his start, got into financial trouble. Well, who bailed him out? Tom Thumb. So
Right.
some of these guys, were making a fortune, on this. And that's not saying, well, we should bring that back. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that there's a lot of hidden history in a lot of our things, just like Woodlon Cemetery and the circuses and the sideshows and things that a lot of people just don't realize. And I think that's the stuff that appeals to me the most. Apparently appeals to you too, or you
Right.
wouldn't be fascinated with circuses and axe murders. So there's a lot of it out there.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the fun stuff as far as I'm concerned.
Now, you were saying in Chicago how that there are, they have several like burlesque and different performing, people that pass there. Now, I can't remember the exact cemetery, but is Resurrection Mary buried in that area or?
Yeah, it's on the southwest side, pretty far on the southwest side, out in the Justice Summit area, kind of south of Summit. The cemetery itself is in Justice, and
Okay.
the Resurrection Mary story has always been one of my favorites. I started digging into Resurrection Mary, so to speak, back in the 70s when there were all of these sightings that were being reported. Starting in, I mean, I was just a kid, but my fascination with vanishing hitchhikers in general started when I was probably 11 or something. That year, Honeycomb Cereal, if you remember Honeycombs, put out
Right.
for Halloween, put out a series of records on the back of their boxes. And of course, I collected them all because they were all ghost stories and cut them out and listened to them in my basement on a record player. And one of them was The Vanishing Hitchhiker, which scared the crap out of me as a kid. So that got me jazzed about vanishing hitchhikers. And just a couple of years right after that, or really right around that time, there was a big spate of Resurrection Mary encounters in Chicago. All these people claiming that they were driving up and down Archer Avenue and that they picked up this girl, this woman in white who disappeared from their car. There were police officers who'd seen her. There was a reverend from a rabbi from a Greek Orthodox church who had picked her up, cab drivers, all these stories. And, that when you're, that age, especially, I mean, I was really, excited to hear all this. And I kind of really never lost that. And over the years, I've dug a lot into that story. I've researched a lot of the backgrounds and the histories. And, it turned out that in the 70s, when all of those sightings were taking place, that wasn't the first time that people had reported Resurrection Mary. There had just been a gap prior to that. She really got started back in the 30s. That's when people started to talk about how they had encountered her, but it wasn't so much that she was appearing in people's cars or getting into cars and disappearing. It's that they were encountering her at the front of Resurrection Cemetery on Archer Avenue as they were driving by. There were stories that claimed that as they passed the cemetery, they'd often see this woman in a pale dress. She'd come running away from the cemetery gates, trying to flag down passing cars. And they claim sometimes she would even jump on the running boards of the cars and try to climb in the windows and all kinds of,
Wow.
which is scary enough. But what made it even scarier is that a lot of these people who were seeing this knew who she was. And they knew she was dead because they had been friends with her and knew she died in March of 1934 when she'd been in a traffic accident. And her name was Mary Bergovi. And she was a real person. I mean, she had gone out dancing one night and had been killed in this crash. And one of her favorite places to dance was just down the road from the cemetery, which is the O. Henry Ballroom, which later became the Willowbrook. Unfortunately, burned down a few years ago. But, it was a big part of the story because that was her favorite spot. And that's where a lot of these people were going when they claimed that they had seen her ghost. She was just a young Polish American factory worker, just an average young girl who, after she was killed in the accident, she was buried in Resurrection Cemetery in a term grave. That was one of those grave sites they set up, the Catholic Church set up for people to use as sort of a rental until they could afford to pay for a real burial plot. But, it's the 1930s. These people were never going to be able to afford a burial plot, and bodies never got moved, including Mary's. But the weird thing is that within a couple of weeks after she died, a cemetery caretaker approached the owner of the funeral home where Mary Bergovi had been prepared for burial, and told him that he'd seen a ghost. Now, John Satala, who was the name of the guy who ran the funeral home, was like, yeah, I don't believe in ghosts. And he said, well, the problem is that this girl I saw, you just prepared her for burial just a few weeks ago. And he described Mary Bergovi to a T. Well, we don't know exactly what John Satala did about it, but he did keep giving interviews about it for years. So it must have freaked him out a little bit.
Sure.
But all these stories started about seeing Mary Bergovi on the side of the road, trying to flag down cars. Now, Mary was described, though, and I've seen her photograph. It's a very pretty girl, short, kind of bobbed, dark hair, kind of curly. And that was the way that everybody was describing this girl for a while. But eventually, after World War II, the stories just sort of stopped. And then in the 70s, they started back up again. Those were the stories I first heard about. Except in this time, not only was she not trying to jump onto passing cars, but people were picking her up to give her a ride back to the cemetery, not going out like Mary Bergovi seemed to do, but coming back. People were encountering her not only at the Willowbrook Ballroom, but other dance halls on the Southwest side, places where people love to go and dance. Well, whoever this girl was, she was described as being a blonde. So not the same as Mary Bergovi, but so many people saw her that it became hard to dismiss the story. There was one guy named Jerry Palis who picked her up at the Liberty Grove Hall one night. She asked for a ride home. He gave her a ride home, and he thought that she was directing him to her house, but they were coming down Archer Avenue, and they pulled to a stop out in front of the gates of Resurrection Cemetery. Now, he assumed she was going to the apartments on the other side of the road, because why would anyone go to a cemetery in the middle of the night? Right. But he said, I can drive you the rest of the way. And she said to Jerry, and listen, I had him tell me this story, and when he told me this, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. But he said she looked at him and said, where I'm going, you can't follow. Wow. Got out of the car and didn't head to the apartments, ran across the street to the cemetery gates and disappeared before she got there. Now, Jerry told and retold this story for like the next 40 years, over and over again, never changed it, never, no reason to lie, never became famous because of it. I mean, there was no reason for him to make this story up. But eventually those sightings stopped too. So we don't know what's going on with Mary because it just sort of faded away. Now, every once in a while, there'll still be a story, but for the most part, things are pretty quiet. Well, I was curious as to why this would be. Why did it stop after World War II and then start back up again? Well, it turned out that in the mid-70s, all the bodies that had been buried in those term graves in the cemetery were moved. They came in and moved that whole section because after World War II, they needed a lot more burial space. So they needed to move the term graves somewhere else. And it's almost like they came in and disturbed the ground where, maybe a couple of different girls, because I think there's more than one ghost who makes up the legend of Resurrection Mary. And I think maybe disturbing their graves is what got things active again. And now it's just sort of calm down all over again. I mean, I'm not going to say she's gone, but she certainly isn't active the way that she used to be.
Right. Well, I'm, just so I guess I'm just geeking out over all this, because we talked about, the axe murders, and then we talked about the circus and Resurrection Mary, and then I'm trying to think what can cap all this off, and the Black Dahlia.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. I had Patty Negri, the Hollywood psychic medium, on my
Yeah.
show a few weeks ago, and she had actually like did a séance or something inside the Hodel house.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so what your book is called Fallen Angel. And what is your
Yeah.
take on what happened with the Black
Well,
Dahlia?
I'm not going to say that no one ever died in the Hodel house,
Mhm.
but I'm going to say it wasn't Beth Short. Um, I've got an entire chapter of the book dedicated to the fact that George Hodel could not have been the Black
Mm.
Dahlia killer.
Okay.
And there's a whole list of reasons why, not to mention his health, the heart attack he had a month before she went missing, the fact that she was out of the country. He was out of the country for at least part of the time that Beth disappeared after coming back to LA. That's that's somebody who really hates his dad. That's all I could come up with. And I got even more, wigged out about the whole thing when he started claiming that his dad was committing all these other murders and was the Zodiac killer and all kinds of stuff. I think that's where things went off the deep end. I I I don't know. I don't know who killed the Black Dahlia. I don't think anybody will ever know. I think it's become so convoluted and such a mess that it's almost impossible to say who could have done it at this point. All we can do is track down where she was and when she was there. And there is unfortunately a gap after she returns to LA that no one can offer any for sure hard, solid evidence of where she was between the time she got back and the time her body was found on January 15th. Nobody can. There are lots of theories, and I love to listen to everybody's theories.
Sure.
I mean, there are some really, reasonable ones and a lot of really crazy ones, because one of the things I've learned more than anything else, whether it be unsolved disappearances or unsolved murders, is there are always uh, dozens of people out there who want to confess to it. Or who want to mess with the press or mess with the police, or worse yet, mess with the families of the people who have lost these people. And that is one of those things that I'll never be able to wrap my head around. And in this case, I think there have been so many theories and so many confessions that it's separating the wheat from the chaff at this point is very, very difficult. And the whole Hodel thing has gotten so much attention, not because it's reasonable, because it's not, because once you look at the facts, it's not written. Don't get me wrong, this guy's a total creep. I mean, he was a
Sure.
horrible, horrible person. He did terrible things. And I wouldn't be surprised if he did murder somebody. But the whole entire thing got started over a photograph that he found in his dad's
Right.
collection that is definitely not Beth Short. It's not. There's no possible way it could be. And that, I mean, that was the start of it, not to mention all the wild stuff that came after. Again, awful guy, did terrible things. I just don't think the Black Dahlia is one of them. I think that I would have been fascinated with the story of, this terrible, horrible person if we didn't try to put the Black Dahlia in it. But once we did, it got some attention. And then, like I keep telling people, just because, it's been on TV or in a magazine doesn't make it true. That's the whole problem I run into with that H.H. Holmes, the serial killer with the murder castle in Chicago,
Mhm.
was Jack the Ripper. No, he wasn't. He couldn't have been. In that case, I do have hard evidence of where he was during the time the Ripper murders were taking place. And he was not in London, he was in Chicago. And there is actual evidence that proves it. But people don't want to hear that because it wasn't on TV,
Right.
and it's the same way with the George Hodel stuff. They see it on TV, it's flashy, it's exciting, it seems legit because this guy's a homicide or a former homicide detective. I'll be honest with you, I've known a lot of them. My grandfather was a cop.
Right.
That doesn't mean anything either. Not that there's not a lot of great guys and great investigators out there, but that's not the be all and end all that people would like it to be sometimes. So they can be just as nutty as the rest of us can. So
Well, let's talk. I guess and kind of finish things with your book, "The Devil Came to St. Louis."
sure.
Sure, yeah, because that is really exciting because you actually is it Roland Doe that they referred him to, or is that
Yeah,
just
Roland Doe
okay?
was the name that he was given in the
Hmm.
diary that was kept during the exorcism to kind of chronicle things. Father Raymond Bishop, who was one of the Jesuits involved in this exorcism, wrote down a chronology of everything that happened, and kind of a bullet pointed list. It's about probably handwritten. It was probably 30 pages. He typed it up when he was finished. It was supposed to be an outline to create a how to guide for future exorcists because there was no modern information in 1949 on how to do an exorcism because neither he nor his partner, Father William Bowdern, were qualified or even remotely interested in being exorcists because it's a high stress job that requires a lot of knowledge, but the whole thing needed to be kept secret. So, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that Roland, as he was known in the diary, they didn't want that to ruin his life, when everything was over. So they gave him that name and then they kept things quiet because, there was a lot of political internal strife going on in St. Louis at the time. It's pretty complicated. But when it was all over, they just decided not to talk about it anymore. But yeah, it turns out I I first wrote about that case. I published my first book about the exorcism back in 2006. So it's been quite a while. And I knew his name then, but when I had done an interview with him, I had promised him that I would not use his name as long as he was alive, and I did not. He passed away, though. He had a stroke in May of 2020 and passed away. And at that point, I was able to rewrite and republish the book. And that was when I was able to publish his name, which was Ronald Hunkler. Ronald, or Ronnie, as he was known back at the time when he was a kid, had been the subject of the exorcism, which started in Maryland and ended up in St. Louis, where the family had relatives. They believed they were sort of led to St. Louis by signs, by things that happened during the activity in the house, which they thought was a ghost. They did not think that it was a demonic possession.
Sure.
So some of the stories that have gotten started, and I've spent a lot of time debunking a lot of the stories that got started about exorcisms that happen at the hospital in Georgetown, and that none of that actually happened. The priest that they've credited with trying to perform an exorcism on Ronnie before he even got to St. Louis never even met Ronnie in person.
Oh,
And
okay.
that was really plain in the diary. He never met Ronnie, but I had heard these stories, and so I was in Maryland and wanted to check it out. So I visited the church, and the pastor there and I went back through the records. And while there was no mention of anything to do with Ronnie, but there were all these stories about how after this aborted exorcism that the priest had become so jangled by what had happened that he spent some time in a mental institution and was
Hmm.
never, and none of that's true. I mean, the guy was busy all the time during all the time that he was supposed to be in an institution. I don't know how that got started. And I say that a lot when it comes to this story. I go, I don't know how that got started, but just remember it's not true. And then, but the way I look at it, and even after all these years of working on this story, I can't sit here and tell you that I know for a fact that Ronald was demonically possessed. I don't know that. I don't even know if I believe in that. What I can tell you though is that something happened to this kid and to his family and to these priests. I mean, they packed up and moved halfway across the country because of things that were happening to them that were so terrifying. In 1949, you didn't just hop on a plane and jet over to St. Louis. It
Hmm.
was an all night train trip in those days to get to St. Louis. And they moved across the country to see if they could find some help. And the priests who were involved would believe until the end of their lives that whatever happened was legitimate. They really truly believed that Ronnie was possessed. And there are a lot of documented things that happened that were reported, even by people who didn't know any of the history, didn't know what was happening. I have collected over the years. I've collected so many interviews. I've talked to every single person that was involved in the exorcism, that was still alive at the point when I started the project. Now there's no one left alive.
Right.
Ronnie was the last one. Everyone is dead now. So there are no more people to talk to. I've gotten all the information as far as firsthand goes that I'm going to get. Um, I'm hoping that maybe someday there'll be more documents that will show up, but unless I plan on attending the seminary and joining the Catholic Church, chances are I'm never going to get to see them
Right.
because handing those out. So I've discovered.
Hey, everybody, this is Misti Gaither, and guess what? We have merch now. That's right, Quest, a journey into true crime and the paranormal. We have t shirts, hoodies, stickers, mugs, just about anything that you would want has the Quest logo on it. Be sure to click on the link below in the comments, and it'll take you right to the site, and you can just pick out what you like and, buy your friends something, buy your family members something. It'll be great. Quest is sponsored by Chef Ron's Gumbo Stop. For award-winning gumbo by an award-winning chef, be sure to check out Chef Ron's Gumbo Stop. It is in Metairie. And just today, it was released that Chef Ron was named the best jambalaya in our area. So that's pretty cool. They also have bread pudding, and be sure to go and check them out. We also have the Haunted Hotel that's on Ursuline Street in New Orleans. And let me tell you, I have stayed there several times. I have investigated there several times. It is very haunted. It is where allegedly the Axeman of New Orleans stayed while he went on his murderous spree. So be sure to go on to hauntedhotelnola.com and book your stay. Book a night, book 2 nights, because you will not be disappointed. We also have Area 51 Gallery for all your merch needs. Rocket, he does our buttons and our magnets. So be sure to go in there if you have a crew, a party, an event, just whatever that you need promoted. Be sure to contact Rocket, and he will consult with you, and your event will be unique because he has unique merchandise. Louisiana Pizza Kitchen Uptown, where every Wednesday is Family and Friends Night. They have half off all adult beverages, including bottles of wine. And you know what? You can also go there on Sundays because they have mimosas and Bloody Marys that are just out of this world and at a good price too. So be sure to check out Louisiana Pizza Kitchen. It's the corner of Carrollton and St. Charles right there at the River Bend. We also are sponsored by Louisiana Spirits. It is a paranormal team that encompasses the whole state of Louisiana. So if you are needing an investigation in your home or business, be sure to contact Louisiana Spirits. They have a Facebook page, and they will take care of you. Well, let me ask you 2 questions.
Sure.
Like you 150 books. I'm sure you're still working on some. What is a particular subject or place that you haven't wrote about that you really want to?
Oh, that is a good question. So I usually keep like a list of future projects, some of which will be digging back into other stories. Some are something brand new. I've written a little bit about the New Orleans Axeman, but that's going to be its own book
Hmm.
coming up. I plan on writing about that. There is a couple of stories that I haven't dug into as deeply as I would like. One of which is I have a thing about music and the supernatural. I did a book called A Song of Dance and Death, which was about musical curses and the dark side of music. But I really want to get into, and I don't even know if anybody will buy it, but I've learned I don't care. with that is I'm just going to write books that I
Right.
like, and there's somebody out there who's going to like it,
Hmm.
but I want to do one on murder ballads and the ghost stories that go along with them. That for some reason is a fascinating topic to me, because that's another one of those lost things like the circus, which, by the way, that's another book that I'm working on, with circuses and sideshows and the ghost stories and things that go along with those too, and the history of it throughout American history. But murder ballads, another one of those kind of lost things that people don't realize what they are anymore,
Hmm.
because we don't really do that much these days. There used to be, anytime some kind of horrific murder would happen, especially down south, somebody write a song and put out a record about it.
Right, right.
I mean, constantly there are songs about, if you start digging back through old murder cases, there's songs about every one of them. They all have songs, and there were records pressed about a lot of them once we got up into that era into the 78s and things. Most of those don't survive, and it's too bad, because that's a bit of history that people don't know exists. So that's on my list too. That's something I'm excited about tackling at some point in the near future too. So
Well, we are certainly going to be posting on this video how to, get in touch with Troy about the books and where you can order them. Just you can order them on AmericaHauntings.com, I believe, and also through Amazon. And like you said, there's plenty of different subjects for everyone.
yeah, people ask me, what's your favorite book? And I go, I don't know. It's like asking me what my favorite kid is. I,
Right.
I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. And they'll go, well, which one will I like? I'm like, I don't know. What do you like? Because I think I've oh boy, I think I've written about it, pretty much every imaginable topic. But I still got a list. This will keep me going till I die. I'll never get tired of writing about something new.
Right. Now, the last question I wanted to ask you
Sure.
is, okay, so you wrote all these books, you do your tours, you have your events, you know, kind of split your time. You still go between Jacksonville and Alton, Illinois.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yep.
So
Yep.
what do you do? Do you are just totally immerse yourself into, uh, true crime and the paranormal, or do you kind of take a break, or is it just that way?
Before I joined you this evening, I was watching recordings of FBI from last night. When I get away from this stuff, even if the topics are still the same, and I read murder stories or watch crime shows on TV, I pretty much still stick with it. But I love my fiction. I love horror films and things that'll take me away from what I do for. Well, I mean, I do all these things so I don't have to have a real job. And so all of these things that I do that keep me busy, I do need an escape, but
Right.
even my pleasure reading usually involves, some kind of murders or something. So I don't think I ever really get away from it. Every once in a while I'll take a vacation that doesn't have anything to do with work, but not very often. It's just, that's all I've done my whole life. Like I said, my grandpa was a cop. And so when I was a little kid, already hearing stories that probably were not suitable for my age. But he didn't care, and neither did I.
Right.
So I think I've just been fed a steady diet of weirdness my whole life, and I can't imagine anything else, honestly.
Well, I tell you what, like I said, I think I found a kindred spirit, and so I hope that you'll join us again because
Sure.
I could sit here and probably talk to you until like 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, we could have
Yeah,
just kept picking books and just
yeah, just like
talked about
started
all
with
of them.
book
So
number one
yeah,
and went down through to 150. So I hope you will join us again,
sure.
and y'all be sure to, like I said, go to American Hauntings or Amazon and pick you out several books because Troy has 150 of them for you to choose
Yeah,
from.
yeah, we
So,
got them.
right.
We got
So,
events if you're in the St. Louis area. We got a museum if you're in the St. Louis area. You name it, we got something for pretty much anybody.
well, it was a joy to get to talk to you. And so,
Yeah,
thank you.
thanks. Thanks for
Yeah.
having me on. I was excited, looking forward to it.
Yeah.
So,
So, thank you everyone for watching this episode, and I'll be back next week. And until then, have a good night.